Youth Rights 101. Kathleen Nicole O'Neal. Why youth? Some people may wonder why I focus so disproportionately on youth issues. After all, young people are not the only people oppressed, either collectively or individually in our society. Structural forces and individual prejudices often conspire to keep women and people of color from being as successful as many white males. Heterosexism is still inscribed into our nation's law codes and animates the belief systems of many people. The situation of disabled and elderly Americans bears many similarities to that of youth, albeit with some key differences. People of size are increasingly scapegoated under the guise of a war on obesity that conveniently doubles as a war on them. Rural people are oppressed both by the condescending attitudes of non-rural people and the very geographic realities of rurality. The poor economy is an increasingly oppressive force in the lives of more and more Americans, including those who would have once been known as middle class or even wealthy. And individuals of all demographic groups are oppressed by the military, medical, and prison industrial complexes, as well as social mores which prize conformity over critical thinking and individuality. So why focus on youth? I focus on youth because minors are the only group of individuals in our society that almost everyone, left or right, religious or secular, educated or ignorant, authoritarian or libertarian, is openly comfortable treating as a subject class. Youth are the only group of people in the United States for whom there is widespread consensus that segregating them from the rest of society, denying them legal rights, keeping them economically dependent, and turning arbitrary authority for them over to other people is not a necessary evil, but the best possible way we individually and collectively can hope to relate to them. I focus on youth because the ills of sexism, racism, heterosexism, ableism, classism, sizeism, rural oppression, poverty, and the military, medical, and prison industrial complexes are complicated and exacerbated by the status of minority. I focus on youth oppression because it is taken for granted, and therefore invisible, despite its ubiquity. I focus on youth because the critical theoretical eye that has problematized the idea of biologically essentialist gender roles and racial identities has not problematized much of the ageist pseudoscience surrounding discourses about child development. I focus on youth because those who decry the warehousing of our elders and people with disabilities in nursing homes and assisted living facilities do not draw parallels with the warehousing of our youth in schools and other institutions. I focus on youth because most libertarians see no contradiction in talking about arbitrary and oppressive state power on the one hand, and using the phrase parents' rights on the other. I talk about youth because a commitment to human liberty and social justice demands youth liberation, and those who claim to support human liberty and social justice rarely acknowledge this. I focus on youth because there is a more organized effort in our society to extend liberty and dignity to animals than to human children. I focus on youth because ageism is one of the greatest unexamined black marks on American society in the early 21st century. I focus on youth because if I don't, few people will. And as long as all of these things are true, I am a radical youth liberation supporter first, last, and always. Youth rights versus child protection. Youth rights can be difficult to pin down. The term itself is vague, although no vaguer than most terms used to describe more established social movements and philosophies. Youth rights is difficult to pin down, primarily because there are a number of philosophies similar in some respects to youth rights that ultimately differ in critical enough ways to distinguish themselves from youth rights. There is also a great deal of ideological diversity within the youth rights movement itself. Those differences may be highlighted in more depth elsewhere on the Youth Rights blog. But this post is intended to focus on the commonalities that make us youth rights supporters, as opposed to something else. Youth rights is, like feminism, first and foremost a frame for viewing issues, in this case, issues affecting young people. It emphasizes the prevalence of ageism as a key prejudice affecting the lives of young people. It problematizes institutions like the family and compulsory education, which are central in the lives of youth. It calls into question assumptions that most thinkers about childhood, education, and the family take for granted about children's capacities. Most critically, youth rights thinkers tend to regard child abuse and child protectionism as two sides of the same coin. In the words of philosopher Howard Cohen, child protection has been concerned with the quality of care of the child, and therefore with the fitness of the caretaker. It has not been concerned with fundamental questions about the nature and limits of adult authority over children. It is the sense that the ways in which adults control children and make decisions for them are themselves a part of the mistreatment and oppression of children which is absent from the ideology and is ignored by the government when it becomes involved. To paraphrase psychologist Richard Farson, we believe that the best way to protect youth is by protecting their rights. That which undermines the right of young people to autonomy and self-determination, even under the misguided assumption that it is for their own welfare, demeans, oppresses, and endangers them. Child abuse and child protectionism are two sides of the same coin. Youth rights supporters believe that youth don't usually need protection from themselves. They need protection from the social, political, legal, economic, and cultural forces that make them a subject class. We recognize that, as has been the case with people with disabilities, when youth need protection, it is usually from the institutions such as schools, the family, and social services agencies that were ironically enough set up for the purpose of protecting them. This is because it is impossible to truly protect someone within a framework that denies them liberty, autonomy, and self-determination, and thereby deprives them of the ability to meet their own needs and desires and to protect themselves.